on Jerusalem Dateline. This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel celebrates President Trump's decision to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Plus, CBN News gets an exclusive interview with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where we discuss topics from geopolitics to faith. And Purim, the Jewish people celebrate their deliverance then and now. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu celebrated President Trump's decision to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel. It came during the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and just a few weeks before national elections.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel.
Near the end of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to Israel, President Trump tweeted out a surprise. After 52 years, it is time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. Standing alongside Pompeo, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was visibly excited and called it a Purim miracle. Netanyahu said recognizing Israel's sovereignty on the Golan was as important as Trump moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal.
Iran is trying to use Syria as a platform to attack and destroy Israel. And the message that President Trump has given the world is that America stands by Israel.
With Israeli elections less than 3 weeks away, the recognition of the Golan Heights during Netanyahu's tenure will likely give a boost in a bid for his re-election. But Trump said his decision was a long time coming and wasn't about Netanyahu and Israeli elections.
I would imagine the other side, whoever's against him, is also in favor of what I just did.
Earlier this month, Israel revealed that Hezbollah terrorists were establishing a network on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. During a visit here, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham said he'd push Congress to recognize the area as part of Israel because it's good for America. Pompeo said as a cadet at West Point, he had studied the battles of the Golan Heights.
There's a famous battle called the Battle of the Valley of Tears. It was Israeli heroism at its most amazing.
During the trip, Pompeo refused to answer questions on the issue, saying U.S. policy hadn't changed and it was up to Trump.
Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel.
Netanyahu said Purim then and now would end the same way.
We're celebrating Purim when 2,500 years ago, other Persians, led by Haman, tried to destroy the Jewish people. They failed then. And today, 2,500 years later, they're going to fail again.
CBN News' David Brody traveled with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Kuwait and then here to Jerusalem, where Brody and I had an exclusive interview with America's top diplomat. We asked him about the peace plan, Syria, and if he thought God raised up President Trump for such a time as this to help the Jewish people.
Secretary Pompeo, thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
It's great to be with you. Great to be with you again.
The Western Wall, I was there with you. What was that experience like? I mean, how impactful was something like that?
So I'd been there before, but this was incredibly special to be there with Israeli Prime Minister and the ambassador from the United States to Israel. Was really an important moment. It was special for me as a Christian. And it was special, I think, to show the commitment the United States has to this democracy, this Jewish nation of Israel.
Speaking of that, you talked yesterday, you talked about being a man of faith. We know you're a man of faith. You talked about that yesterday. And I'm wondering about that apex between Israel and Christianity and the Bible coming alive in this land. Can you talk about that a little bit and what that's all about, the relationship between the two?
So here we are in Jerusalem. The city that's so important to all three Abrahamic religions. Certainly, I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as well. I got to see That was the second time I had a chance to do that in my life. As a Christian, to go to that place that is so fundamental to the things you believe is just a very special thing. And at the same time, I'm the Secretary of State, tasked with defending the Constitution, supporting the President in his mission to keep our nation safe and to keep Israel safe. It's really quite something to be here and have this opportunity to travel to a place like the Western Wall with all its history. We had a chance to go down and see some of the tunnels, the excavation that's been done there as well. That history reminds you of the history of the Jewish people here on this land. It reminds you of all of the rich religious traditions here in this place and how special Jerusalem really is. It makes you even more proud of the decision President Trump made to designate this and to show that this is truly the capital of Israel.
And that happened just over a year ago when they...
it seems like a long time ago.
I know. And making history, and a lot of evangelicals and Israelis were ecstatic about moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but some are concerned about what might happen or what price they might pay in the peace plan that's upcoming right now. And so they're concerned about that. What can you do to allay their fears of something like dividing Jerusalem in the upcoming peace plan?
So I've seen the details of the plan as it stands now. I'm sure there'll be things moved just a bit as time goes on. But evangelicals of the world should know that this is a vision for what might ultimately lead to this resolution of this conflict. I think we all want a better life for the Palestinian people. We want a path where the Palestinians and the Israelis aren't in conflict. That would be good for the region, good for Jerusalem, good for the world. And I think this plan presents a vision for that, but doesn't sacrifice any of these core principles, frankly, of any of the faiths.
As we do rapid fire, let's move to the United States for a moment and anti-Semitism and the Democrats. They seem embroiled in this. There was I don't want to say a veiled shot, not that it was a shot, but at Ilhan Omar, about the bigotry and the anti-Semitism inside the halls of Capitol Hill. How concerned are you about the rise of not just anti-Semitism around the world, but in that Democrat Party as well?
To see this from a member of Congress like Congresswoman Omar I talked about this being dark. The rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe and frankly all across the world is something that is deeply troubling. And to see someone, a duly elected congressman, behave in that way, to speak about anti-Semitism in that way is of great concern. It's great concern to me. This administration speaks the truth. And anti-Semitism is unacceptable in any form from anyone, but to see it come from one of America's leaders is just abhorrent.
Mr. Secretary, back here in the Middle East, you're heading to Lebanon, the last leg of your trip, and yet Lebanon is dominated in many ways by Hezbollah with maybe more than 100,000 rockets, building tunnels into the northern Galilee and setting up a military infrastructure on the Golan Heights, or trying to anyway. What can you do and the U.S. do to reduce this threat to Israel and to into Lebanon itself?
Well, it's a great question. That's certainly part of my mission when I travel to Lebanon. It's unfortunate. For the last decade, under the previous administration, Hezbollah was permitted to grow its capabilities, to grow its resources, almost unchecked, and to seep its way in to Lebanese politics. The Lebanese people don't want that. They deserve better. This is a nation with a rich, deep tradition. And so our mission, the reason I'm going there is to show them what America is prepared to do to help, to push back against the threat from Hezbollah, to tell them that getting anywhere near Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, is of great risk to their nation, and then to work on some of the security aspects of the relationship as well, to make sure they understand the threat that Hezbollah's military power inside of Lebanon poses to that entire country.
Up next, more of our interview with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about the Middle East and the Bible. Here's more of our interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where we discuss the new government in northeast Syria and whether or not President Trump might be playing a role just like an ancient biblical character did 2,500 years ago, Queen Esther. Northeast Syria has been in the news a lot in the last couple of months, and you know there's a new democracy there that represents all the people, protects religious freedom and Christians, and even puts a priority on the role of women. What can you tell those people, that new government and many of the Christians there, about what the U.S. will do to protect that new democracy, even as it's surrounded by many countries that are threatening that area?
So when we think about Syria and the Trump administration, we think about the entire region, right, extending from Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean. We were just talking about Lebanon. The challenges in Syria remain. The United States intends to remain. We are close to the destruction of the caliphate. It will be completed very, very soon. But the threat from radical Islamic terrorism continues, and so there will be a required continued effort from the United States to push back against ISIS in the region. But the work that's been done in Iraq, we forget the days when there were prisoners in cages and beheadings on the beach. It seems distant, but it took enormous work from this administration to take the caliphate down, and now it's in its final throes. There's real work to develop democracy in Iraq, to work to develop an independent, sovereign nation there. We are hard at that, and I am confident that the nations of the region, the Gulf states, will all work to make sure that Iraq has an opportunity to be independent from Iran, free and sovereign nation.
And are you encouraged by that new democracy?
Yes, but these things take work. They take work everywhere, and to have that take root here in the Middle East is always a challenge, but we're determined to put our shoulder to the task.
And you also mentioned a Bible story last night when you had your statements with the Prime Minister. Today's being Purim, celebration, Jews worldwide. And here in Jerusalem are talking about the fact that Esther, 2,500 years ago, saved the Jewish people with God's help from Haman. And now 2,500 years later, there's a new Haman here in the Middle East that wants to eradicate the Jewish people just like Haman did the state of Iran. Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. It was remarkable. So we were down in the tunnels where we could see 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, if I have the history just right, to see the remarkable history of the faith in this place and the work that our administration has done to make sure that this democracy in the Middle East of this Jewish state remains. I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Very nice. Secretary Pompeo, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
You can see from our interview how much the U.S. and the Secretary of State stand with Israel. The Trump administration has consistently said Israel has the right to defend itself. Yet the United Nations Human Rights Council just issued a report on Israel's response to the Gaza border riots, and it calls for some Israelis to be tried as war criminals. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
The report came on the same day Israel buried a 19-year-old soldier and a beloved rabbi killed by a Palestinian terrorist. The UN Human Rights Council condemns Israel's fight against violent protests on the Gaza border.
We found reasonable grounds to believe that the Israeli security forces committed serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law.
It's been nearly a year since Palestinians launched the protests with the goal of breaching Israel's border. Known as the Great March of Return, experts say it's anything but peaceful.
The report completely and utterly ignores the fact that these are very violent demonstrations, including the use of firearms and throwing grenades, breaking through the security fence, people who've been given maps of Israeli towns and villages in close proximity to the border fence so that they can get there and kill as many Israelis as they can.
The clearest comparison you can give to the UN's latest report on the events in Gaza is maybe comparing it to a report on the D-Day landing of the Allied forces during the Second World War, looking at that event alone, and then claiming that the Allied forces were the aggressors against the Nazis.
According to the report, Israel killed 189 peaceful protesters last year. Ambassador Alan Baker from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs calls those demonstrations well planned.
And they say, well, all these are, they include children and they're peaceful people who weren't doing anything. In actual fact, the Hamas itself has publicized the fact that virtually all these people are senior Hamas terrorists.
Attorney Maurice Hirsch from the Palestinian Media Watch sees a clear agenda in the March of Return.
It's to allow the refugees from Gaza to return to Israel and basically kill all of the Jews in their path.
The hatred has been enforced by Palestinian Authority teaching.
The education system of the Palestinian Authority teaches kids to see terrorist murderers as heroes, encourages them to take part in terrorism, and then rewards them for being arrested in acts of terrorism.
In addition to violence, Palestinians made headlines during the last year for launching balloons and kites armed with incendiary and explosive devices across the border. Hirsch said Hamas even posted instructions on social media.
These are acts of war. These are violent demonstrations organized by terrorist groups who put out clear instructions on Facebook saying, hide your weapons, not so that the Israeli soldiers won't see them, but hide them so that you can kidnap Israelis and pass them over to the resistance forces.
Baker calls Israel's actions justified.
And if these people are firing weapons or throwing grenades or sending explosive kites and balloons, then Israel's got every right to defend itself. And one of the striking aspects of this report is the complete and utter denial of the right of Israel to defend itself.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, behind the scenes of our interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and where does the Middle East go from here? Well, joining me to talk more about the Mike Pompeo interview is CBN senior political correspondent David Brody, who was embedded with the Secretary of State. David, tell us behind the scenes, what was it like to be embedded with the Mike Pompeo? You were in Kuwait, and then you came here to Jerusalem.
Yeah, it was pretty fascinating, actually. We had about 10 or so traveling press with us, or with him, I should say. And, you know, he came on the plane and talked to us right at the beginning of a long 13-hour flight. Right. And then after that, you know, he was, it's interesting how his maneuvers are with reporters, and including myself, and I know NBC's Andrea Mitchell was there too, and so he's pretty stoic. I mean, in other words, he doesn't really want to communicate too much with the media, but he knows he has to. And then at the last moment, we got an on-the-record briefing. Yeah. So a lot of times when you travel, whether it be Secretary Pompeo, Mike Pence, whoever it is, a lot of this is last second. So things will just happen, and you have to keep moving in what we call the traveling press. Or the
it's very fast. I mean, you go from place to place.
Yeah.
In fact, I know some of the we've been with Vice President Pence, and it's almost like a track meet. You have to run from one place to the other.
That's right, or you're missing it.
Yeah, yeah. So part of the reason you're with the Secretary of State is a profile on his faith and his past. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, he wears his faith on his sleeve, and we figured we wanted to explore that, and so you know, we did.
Right.
You know, we explored it, and you heard some of that, right,
yeah,
Chris?
We did.
Yeah,
we did.
You were there, right?
I was there.
I saw the video. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're doing that, and so we'll really give you a kind of an in-depth look of how his faith informs his policy views. I mean, this goes back to doing Bible studies on Capitol Hill. I mean, he was a Boy Scout, and faith was important back then. He talks about his coming to Jesus story at West Point. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, and we'll do it on the 700 Club.
And that'll be in a week or two?
Yeah, a week or two when I recover from this trip.
It's been an exhausting trip. I know behind the scenes. It's up late, up early. I've been doing a lot of stories for the 700 Club as well. Tell us a little bit of behind the scenes that we were involved in about forming the questions for our interview. Right. Well, you know, you have to be judicious, and you have to be smart, and you have to have a strategy, because we had 10 minutes with him, and we literally had 10 minutes, as we know. And so you really have to kind of make sure your questions are targeted. Make sure that you're really kind of covering some new ground, maybe in a different way that other folks aren't going to ask. And of course, at CBN, that's what we do, and that's a good thing. Right. And so that was kind of our strategy session on the questions. And one of the questions that I had the opportunity to ask at the very end has really been making some news. I mean, even now, it's the mainstream media has picked up on that question quite a lot. For sure. Well, anytime you put Donald Trump with a biblical figure, that's the news cycle right there. And that's exactly what he did with Queen Esther and Donald Trump. And but it is interesting to see the way the media plays that. You know, Mike Pompeo said, as you saw, it was possible that he could be a Queen Esther. And of course, the media is now saying, he said, Donald Trump is Queen Esther. He's come to Earth to save Israel. So it's just interesting how they kind of balloon it a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Well, David, it's been great to partner with you, to collaborate with you on the interview and here in Jerusalem. You got to come back. I'm going to come back. Didn't I say that last time? You did say that last time. But then I came back. That's right. You did come back. I did come back, but from a personal standpoint, I want to come back as well. So it's been great. Love to be here. Love having you, and appreciate the great work you do there in Washington, D.C. and Faith Nation, the new show. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Up next, the celebration of Purim. Jews on the streets of Jerusalem and throughout the world celebrate the deliverance of the Jewish people 2,500 years ago in ancient Persia. The Feast of Purim celebrates the deliverance of the Jewish people 2,500 years ago from the evil plot of a Persian official named Haman. Back then, God used Queen Esther to reveal the plot to the king and save the Jewish people. Today, people dress up in costumes, take to the streets, and celebrate that deliverance. They also remember that today, Iran, which is ancient Persia, still wants to annihilate the Jewish people, just like Haman did. Here's what it looks like on the streets of Jerusalem. Here in Israel, you can see that the ancient holidays, they seem just as relevant thousands of years ago as they are today. With the threats that face Israel now, just like in the times of Esther, please continue to pray for the protection of the Jewish people and for the peace of Jerusalem. Well, that's all for this edition. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.